Christopher Columbus was a sailor who wanted to find a new route to Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean. He convinced the King and Queen of Spain to fund his expedition, and set sail with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. On his first voyage, he landed on an island in the Bahamas, where he met the native people, called the Taino. They were friendly and curious, and offered to trade with Columbus and his men. They gave them cotton, fruit, fish, and parrots in exchange for glass beads, bells, knives, and other trinkets. Columbus was delighted with his discovery, and decided to claim the island for Spain. He also decided to take some of the Taino as slaves, and some of the parrots as pets. He thought they would make a good impression when he returned to Europe. One of the parrots that Columbus took was a very clever and talkative bird. It had learned some Spanish words from the sailors, and could mimic their voices and sounds. It also had a mischievous personality, and liked to play tricks on people. The parrot belonged to a sailor named Pedro, who was very proud of his feathered friend. He taught him how to say his name, and how to greet people. He also taught him some rude words and insults, which he thought were funny. Pedro kept the parrot in a cage in his cabin on the Santa Maria, the largest and most important ship of the fleet. He often took him out to show him off to his fellow sailors, or to entertain them with his jokes and imitations. One day, Pedro decided to take the parrot to see the captain of the ship, Christopher Columbus himself. He thought that Columbus would be impressed by his parrot's skills, and maybe reward him with some extra food or money. He knocked on the door of Columbus's cabin, and heard a voice saying, "Come in." He opened the door, and saw Columbus sitting at his desk, writing in his journal. He saluted him, and said, "Good day, sir. I have something to show you." Columbus looked up from his writing, and saw Pedro holding a cage with a colorful parrot inside. He frowned, and said, "What is this? A bird?" "Yes, sir," Pedro said. "A very special bird. A talking bird." "A talking bird?" Columbus repeated skeptically. "What can it say?" "Many things, sir," Pedro said eagerly. "He can say his name, he can greet people, he can even sing songs." "Really?" Columbus said. "Let me hear it then." Pedro put the cage on the desk, and opened it. He took out the parrot, and held it on his finger. He said, "Say hello to the captain, Parrot." The parrot looked at Columbus with its bright eyes, and said, "Hello, Captain." Columbus was surprised, and said, "Hello, Parrot." The parrot said, "Hello, Parrot." Columbus smiled slightly, and said, "That's clever. What else can it say?" Pedro said he can say his name. "Tell him your name, Parrot." The parrot said, "My name is Pedro." Columbus raised his eyebrows, and said, "Your name is Pedro?" "That's my sailor's name." The parrot said, "Your name is Pedro?" "That's my sailor's name." Columbus laughed softly, and said, "That's amusing. What else can it do?" Pedro said he can sing songs. "Sing a song for the captain, Parrot." The parrot opened its beak, and sang a tune that sounded like a sea shanty. It was a catchy melody, but the words were very rude and vulgar. They were about Columbus's mother, his wife, his daughter, and his dog. Columbus's face turned red with anger as he listened to the insulting song. He shouted, "Stop! Stop that at once! How dare you teach your bird such filth?" Pedro was shocked and scared. He quickly grabbed the parrot from his finger and put it back in the cage. He stammered, "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to offend you. It was just a joke." "A joke?" Columbus yelled. "A joke? You think this is funny? You think this is how you respect your captain? You think this is how you honor your king and queen?" Pedro shook his head nervously and said, "No, sir. No, of course not." Columbus stood up from his desk and grabbed the cage with the parrot. He said, "You have gone too far, Pedro. You have crossed the line. You have insulted me, and you have insulted Spain. You know what the punishment is for such a crime?" Pedro gulped and said, "No, sir." "What is it?" Columbus said, "You and your bird will walk the plank." Pedro gasped and said, "Walk the plank? But, sir, that's cruel. That's inhuman. That's—" Columbus interrupted him and said, "That's justice. Come on, let's go." He dragged Pedro and the parrot out of his cabin and towards the deck of the ship. He called out to the other sailors and said, "Attention, everyone. I have an announcement to make. This sailor here, Pedro, has committed a grave offense against me and against Spain. He has taught his parrot to sing a song that insults me and my family. For this, he and his bird will walk the plank." The other sailors gathered around and watched in horror as Columbus pushed Pedro and the parrot to the edge of the ship. Pedro begged for mercy and said, "Please, sir. Please don't do this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." The parrot also pleaded for its life and said, "Please, sir. Please don't do this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Columbus ignored them and said, "Too late for apologies. You should have thought of that before you made fun of me. Now, say goodbye to your life." He kicked Pedro and the parrot off the ship and into the water below. They splashed into the waves and sank out of sight. Columbus turned to the other sailors and said, "Let this be a lesson to you all. Never disrespect your captain or your country, or else you will suffer the same fate as Pedro and his parrot." The sailors nodded in fear and said, "Yes, sir. Yes, Captain." Columbus nodded back and said, "Good. Now, back to work." He walked back to his cabin, feeling satisfied with his justice. But he didn't notice that the parrot had managed to grab onto a rope that was hanging from the ship's mast. It climbed up the rope and flew back to the deck. It landed on a barrel near Columbus's cabin and waited for him to come out. When Columbus came out of his cabin a few minutes later, he saw the parrot sitting on the barrel. He was shocked and said, "What? You're still alive? How did you survive?" The parrot looked at him with a smirk and said, "I can swim." Then it opened its beak and sang another song. It was a song about Columbus's nose, his ears, his eyes, and his beard. It was even ruder and funnier than the first one. Moral of the story is: don't be cruel to animals or people. They might come back to haunt you.
Thank you for listening. For more stories like this, please consider subscribing.